The turn of the screw. The unfinished chapter. Lydia thought it was over. She had confronted Peter Quint, freed Flora and Miles, and left Bly Manor behind. But the deeper she tried to bury the experience, the more the shadows seemed to creep into her life. Days turned into weeks, and the nightmares returned. Not of the children this time, but of something far older and darker. It began subtly. Objects in her apartment were out of place. Lights flickered, even when there was no electrical fault. The mirror she had used to trap Peter Quint had cracked down the middle, its shards reflecting warped and distorted images of her own face. And then there were the whispers, low, guttural voices she couldn't understand, but which filled her with an unshakable sense of dread. One night, while reviewing the recordings she'd taken at Bly Manor, Lydia froze. In the footage from the nursery, moments after Peter Quint's form had been absorbed into the mirror, something else appeared. A dark, amorphous figure, towering and grotesque, lingered in the background. Its face was a void, its body shifting like smoke. It watched the ritual from the shadows, as if waiting for Quint's defeat. Lydia realized with a sinking heart that Peter Quint had been just the beginning. The return to Bly. Unable to shake the feeling that something remained unfinished, Lydia reached out to Mrs. Groves again. The old caretaker was hesitant to speak, but after much prodding, she finally relented. "What you dealt with wasn't just Peter," Mrs. Groves said. "The manor, it's alive. Quint and Jessel were pawns. Whatever controls Bly is ancient, something that's been there long before the manor was built. It doesn't just haunt, it consumes." Lydia's stomach turned. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because you wouldn't have believed me," Mrs. Groves replied, her voice trembling. "And because once you know the truth, it doesn't let you go." Lydia's mind raced. If the entity controlling Bly wasn't destroyed, would Flora and Miles truly be free? Or had she only released them into the grasp of something far worse? There was only one way to find out. Despite every instinct screaming at her to stay away, Lydia prepared to return to Bly Manor. She couldn't leave the job half done, no matter how much it terrified her. This time, she armed herself with every protection she could find: blessed salt, iron, candles, and an ancient text Mrs. Groves had reluctantly given her, detailing a banishment ritual. As she approached the manor, the air felt heavier, thicker, as if the house itself sensed her arrival. Bly loomed in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding, like the hollow eyes of a predator waiting to strike. Confronting the entity. Lydia stepped through the front doors and immediately felt it. The oppressive presence was stronger than before, suffocating in its intensity. The walls seemed to pulse as if the house were breathing, and the faint sound of whispers echoed from every corner. She made her way to the grand foyer, where the banishment ritual would begin. The book instructed her to create a circle of protection, using salt and light 4 black candles to anchor her energy. As she lit the final candle, the temperature plummeted, and the whispers grew louder, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. "Show yourself," Lydia demanded, her voice trembling but firm. "I know you're here." The shadows in the room began to coalesce, forming a massive, writhing figure. Its shape was ever-changing, its body made of smoke and darkness. But its presence was undeniable. The void where its face should have been seemed to pull at her, drawing her closer. "You think you can banish me?" The voice was everywhere, deep and resonant, vibrating through the walls and her very bones. "I am Bly. I am everything." Lydia fought the urge to flee. "You have no power here anymore," she said, repeating the mantra she had used against Quint. Your hold on this place is over." The entity laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You freed the children, but they are mine, just as you will be." The candles flickered as the entity surged toward her, its shadowy tendrils reaching for the protective circle. Lydia began the ritual, reciting the ancient incantation from the book. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue, the words flowing faster as the entity roared in anger. The room shook violently, the walls cracking as the entity fought against the ritual's power. Lydia could feel its fury, its desperation to maintain its hold on Bly. She poured every ounce of her will into the incantation, her voice growing louder as the shadows swirled around her. "Begone!" she screamed, holding the mirror high. The entity recoiled, its form shrinking, collapsing inward as the ritual reached its climax. With a final deafening roar, the entity exploded into a cloud of black smoke, which was sucked into the mirror. The silence that followed was deafening. Lydia collapsed to the floor, her body trembling from exhaustion. For a long moment, she simply lay there, the weight of what she had just done pressing down on her. Then slowly she stood and looked around. The air was lighter, the oppressive energy gone. The manor felt empty. As she walked through the house one last time, Lydia noticed the changes. The nursery, once filled with an almost palpable sadness, was now just a room. The dollhouse was gone, and the air no longer felt heavy. The spirits of Bly had been freed, and the darkness that had controlled the manor for centuries had finally been banished. Lydia left Bly Manor as the sun began to rise, its warm rays casting the house in a soft, golden light. For the first time, the manor didn't feel like a predator. It felt like a relic of the past, its power broken. But as she drove away, the mirror sitting on the passenger seat cracked further. A low, almost imperceptible laugh echoing from within. Lydia barely made it back to her apartment. Exhaustion weighed heavy on her, and yet sleep didn't come. Her thoughts were consumed by the events at Bly Manor. She had defeated the entity, or so she thought. But the cracked mirror and the faint laugh haunted her. Was it truly over, or had she only angered something far worse? The mirror sat on her kitchen counter, covered in a thick black cloth. She couldn't bring herself to destroy it. Part of her feared what might be released if she did. But even hidden, it felt alive, its presence a constant hum in the back of her mind. That night, Lydia's dreams were anything but restful. In her dream, Lydia was back at Bly Manor, walking through its endless hallways. The walls seemed to stretch and shift, the doors leading nowhere. She could hear faint whispers, familiar voices calling her name. "Lydia, come back." She turned a corner and froze. Flora and Miles stood in front of her, their faces blank, their eyes wide and unblinking. "You didn't save us," Miles said, his voice a hollow echo. "You only woke it." "What do you mean?" Lydia asked, her voice trembling. Flora stepped closer, her hand outstretched. "You took away its form, but you didn't destroy it. Now it's everywhere." Suddenly, the shadows around them began to shift, pooling into a massive, amorphous shape. The entity loomed above her, its void-like face now larger and more menacing than ever. "You cannot contain me," it growled. "I am endless." Lydia woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. The clock on her nightstand read 3:33 a.m. The room was eerily silent, but she could feel it. The entity's presence wasn't just at Bly anymore. It had followed her. In the following days, Lydia's life spiraled into chaos. The entity made itself known in subtle, insidious ways. Objects in her apartment moved when she wasn't looking. Lights flickered incessantly, plunging her into darkness at the worst moments. Shadows seemed to lengthen unnaturally, creeping toward her like living things. The mirror became the center of the activity. Every time Lydia tried to ignore it, the disturbances grew worse. One night, she heard faint whispers emanating from beneath the cloth. When she dared to lift it, her reflection was no longer her own. Instead, she saw Bly Manor's endless hallways, the entity's shifting form moving in the distance. Desperate, Lydia reached out to Mrs. Groves again, but this time, the call went unanswered. She tried contacting paranormal experts, historians, even occult practitioners, but none had answers for her. Every attempt to rid herself of the mirror failed. The entity's hold was unbreakable. One evening, Lydia decided to confront the mirror directly. Armed with the same book that had helped her banish the entity from Bly, she prepared another ritual. This time, the goal was to destroy the mirror and whatever remained trapped inside. She drew a protective circle around herself, lit the candles, and began chanting the incantation. The air grew heavy, the room darkening as the entity's presence intensified. The mirror began to shake violently, the cracks spreading like spiderwebs across its surface. "Release me," the entity's voice boomed, shaking the walls of her apartment. "You cannot contain what I am." Lydia's voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. The ritual was working. The entity's screams grew louder, more frantic. But as the final words left her lips, the mirror shattered with an ear-piercing scream, and a dark cloud erupted from it, enveloping the room. When the smoke cleared, Lydia found herself standing not in her apartment, but back in Bly Manor's nursery. The air was icy, the room bathed in an unnatural glow. The entity's voice echoed all around her. "You think you can destroy me? I am Bly. I am every shadow, every fear. You belong to me now." Lydia realized with horror that the ritual hadn't destroyed the entity. It had pulled her back into its domain. The shattered mirror had been a doorway, and she had walked right through it. Now trapped within Bly Manor's twisted reality, Lydia wandered its halls endlessly. The rooms shifted and changed, leading her deeper into the house's labyrinthine corridors. She saw glimpses of Flora and Miles, their faces pale and expressionless, watching her from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come back," Flora whispered one night, her voice barely audible. "Now you'll never leave." Lydia fought to hold on to her sanity, but the Manor's influence was overwhelming. Time lost all meaning. Days, weeks, months. She couldn't tell how long she had been there. The entity tormented her at every turn, its voice a constant reminder of her failure. But Lydia refused to give up. Somewhere deep inside, she knew there had to be a way to escape, not just for her, but for all the souls Bly had consumed. She began searching the Manor for clues, piecing together its dark history, hoping to find the key to its destruction. One day, while exploring the basement, Lydia discovered something she had never seen before, a hidden chamber filled with ancient artifacts. In the center of the room was a pedestal, upon which sat a tattered book, bound in black leather. Its cover bore a single word: deliverance. As Lydia opened the book, a sense of hope stirred within her. The pages detailed a final ritual, one that could sever the entity's hold on Bly Manor forever. But the cost was steep. It required a life to bind the entity, trapping it in its own prison for eternity. Lydia's heart sank. Was she willing to sacrifice herself to end Bly's reign of terror? Did she have any other choice? Lydia stared at the book, her trembling hands brushing over the word deliverance. The ritual described within was her last hope, but it came at the ultimate cost: her own life. The air in the hidden chamber was heavy with an ancient presence, as if the very walls were aware of her discovery. The faint whispers began again, growing louder and more insistent. "Don't do it," came a familiar voice. Lydia turned to see Miles and Flora standing in the doorway, their faces pale and tear-streaked. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Flora said. Lydia's heart clenched. "If I don't, who will? This thing has taken enough lives. It ends here." "You think it will stop with you?" Miles asked, his voice hollow. "It won't. It will only grow stronger. You can't destroy what is eternal." Ignoring the children's warnings, Lydia began gathering the items needed for the ritual: an iron dagger, black candles, a vial of salt from sacred ground, and a piece of her own blood-stained clothing. The book explained that these items would bind the entity to its prison, but only if Lydia willingly gave her life in the process. As she prepared the ritual, the manor grew restless. Doors slammed shut of their own accord, furniture scraped against the floors, and the air filled with an oppressive, almost suffocating heat. The entity knew what she was planning, and it was furious. When Lydia reached the grand foyer to begin the ritual, the shadows around her thickened, twisting and writhing like living creatures. The entity's voice boomed from all directions. "You cannot defeat me, Lydia. This house, this power, it's older than you can comprehend. You are nothing to me." But Lydia stood her ground, her voice steady, as she began to chant the incantation. As the ritual progressed, the shadows coalesced into a single, massive form. The entity's true visage was horrifying, a swirling mass of darkness, tendrils reaching out like claws, its void-like face radiating pure malice. "You think you are strong enough to face me?" It roared, the sound shaking the entire manor. Lydia ignored the fear gripping her heart and continued chanting. The black candles flared to life, their flames burning brighter with each word. The air around her shimmered as the protective circle she had drawn began to glow. The entity lunged at her, but the circle held. It screamed in rage, its form shrinking and writhing as the ritual's power grew stronger. The final step of the ritual required Lydia to pierce her heart with the iron dagger. Her hands shook as she raised the blade, tears streaming down her face. She thought of the lives lost to Bly Manor, the children trapped in its clutches, and the countless others who might suffer if she failed. "This ends now," she whispered, with a deep breath. Lydia drove the dagger into her chest. Pain exploded through her body, but she held on to the words of the incantation, repeating them even as her vision blurred. The entity let out an ear-splitting scream, its form collapsing inward as the ritual took effect. The shadows dissolved, the oppressive energy lifting as the manor's power waned. Lydia fell to the ground, her blood pooling around her as the candles extinguished one by one. The air was still, the house silent. When Lydia opened her eyes, she was no longer in the manor. She stood in a serene field, bathed in golden light, her pain gone. In the distance, she saw Flora and Miles, their faces bright and untroubled. "Thank you," Flora said softly. "You freed us." Lydia smiled, tears of relief streaming down her face. She had succeeded. The entity was gone, its power broken, and Bly Manor was just a house now, no longer a prison for lost souls. Back in the real world, Bly Manor stood empty, its dark history finally laid to rest. The mirror in Lydia's apartment was gone, and her story became a whispered legend, a warning to those who dared to confront the unknown. But in the stillness of the night, some swore they could hear a faint whisper in the wind, as if Bly's shadows had not been entirely extinguished.